Welcome to The Most Mindset, where you'll hear real conversations about mindset, mortgages, and mastery for loan officers and originators who have outgrown being undervalued and underpaid. Here's your host, Michael Most.
Welcome, everybody, back to The Most Mindset. I am joined today by one of my very good friends, Chris Davis. Chris, welcome aboard, brother.
Thanks for having me here, buddy.
Yeah.
Nice to be here, buddy. Yeah.
How are you? I wanted to maybe start out with a little bit of maybe your background and how even we met. So why don't you just take us back, like just from the very, very beginning? You know, you actually live, so that everyone that might know or might not know, I live in Southern California, originally from New York, but you're in Northern Cal, which is a very different market. And although to anyone on the East Coast, California is just all Californians, right? There's two very different markets. So why don't you walk me through some of the baby steps of getting into the business, a little bit about you and your background.
Sure. Well, it's an interesting story, which I like to share. Late 90s, post-collegiate. I live in the Bay Area, which of course is home to the bulk of the tech industry. And at that time I was working for, it was a really serendipitous path. I walked into an office selling the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I mean, I'm in my mid-20s. Walk into this guy's office and he's all, "Hey, I really like how you present yourself. Why don't you come work for me?" And I didn't like what I was doing at the time. And so I moved into the tech industry and I was selling IT consulting services, which at that time started to go offshore to China and India, like your call centers now, right? And those projects that I had, some of my big clients were the Chevrons and the Kaiser Hospitals and Bank of America. So I was walking the halls of Bank of America one day and trying to sell a large consulting staff to a project they were working on. And this is funny, Michael, you'll like this. They were working on this new thing called the internet. And the product was called Home Focus Valuation. I'll never forget. Home Focus Valuation was a portal for the mortgage industry, the mortgage division of Bank of America to communicate and exchange information on appraisal. And so one of the managers, one of the users that was walking the halls with me said to me at the time, "Hey, you'd be good at this. You should come work for us." And this was when all of my projects were being offshored. And I said, I think I might try it. And what's interesting is they threw me into the pond and I had to swim to shore. I mean, I really didn't have a background. I didn't start off as a processor. I didn't really have much of a background in real estate. I used to brag to people I always wanted to be in real estate because I felt like it was a great wealth building tool. And I wanted to understand it more. And it's certainly been a terrific path for me. But that was around 2000. I started working in the retail bank side of our industry above water. And look at me, right? 2000 loans later.
So let's back up for a second. You mentioned that you were in a different industry, doing a different job, and didn't really like it. What was your first job? So let's back up to like Chris as a kid. You grow up and you have aspirations. You went to college? Where'd you go to school?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Napa Valley, which is unusual. Napa's not a big place. Everybody knows it, but I'm a wine country child. I went to college in San Diego. Went to San Diego State, right? And when I finished that, I went back up to the wine country, worked a little bit, saved a bunch of money. I don't know if you knew this about me, but I bought a one-way ticket to Madrid, Spain, and I went backpacking around the world for 2 years by myself.
It's about you.
Yeah. I was a nomad in my mid-20s, seeing the world, so to speak. Great experience, good education, came back, moved to San Francisco, which was always my design. I love that city. And like I said, was working for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, walked into an office. And these were my first jobs out of college. I walked into the office of a company called System Solutions, which is no longer around. But that sort of skyrocketed me into this little story I just told you. And then, of course, they said, "Well, come work for us." My mortgage career started then.
Growing back, so you're growing up, you wanted to be a school teacher, you wanted to be a marine biologist. What was like the big dream?
When I was a young man, so my family, I think my mom especially, because she was pretty well known in the wine industry, I think she probably would have preferred that I stay in the family business and go into wine. I always found
that your family business?
Well, my mom was a sales and marketing manager this is a great story. My mom was the very first sales and marketing manager for this little known winery at the time called Silver Oak Cellars in 1973.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Right.
Hope you still get royalties there.
I wish. Yeah. Uh, anyway, so uh, this is probably not the most appropriate thing to say on a podcast, but I always found the wine
His
industry,
friend.
my wine industry experience was, I always found it to be a little pretentious. I used to work in the tasting rooms, and some knucklehead would stumble in there with his nose in a Wine Spectator, and this got a 96. I want a case of it. I'm like, aren't you going to try it? And people used to ask me, what's a good wine? And I used to say, if you like White Zinfandel with ice cubes, that's a good wine. If that's what you like. So yeah, my dad was an engineer in semicon, which makes sense for being around here. But you said a marine biologist. That's fun you say that. I used to be obsessed with marine biology. I used to think that might be my path. When I was, 16, 18, I took a bunch of classes in college and said, I'm not sure about this. So I didn't end up pursuing that. I ended up getting a degree in political science and economics, which again, you know,
Well, that's interesting because we always take from some sort of our childhood and things of that nature. We always take a little bit of that path. And what would you say? I mean, I know you, I've gotten to know you pretty well. And one of the things that I find very interesting is the comment you just made, which is you're in a wine tasting room, and that's a tough position to be in because the truth is, call it pretentious, call it whatever you want. Most people don't really know wines. They really don't. They don't even know what they're tasting. They don't know what they're doing, but they love the culture of wine. And part of that comes from people like you that are in a wine tasting room and guiding them a little bit. So it's interesting that you grew and learned quite maturely of yourself how one size doesn't fit all was kind of like a really good takeaway. And to your point, whatever makes one person happy doesn't necessarily mean that we have to make everyone happy. Would you say that a lot of that has crossed over into what you do in this world? I mean, doing it for almost 25 years now. Does that correlate well for you when it comes to meeting clients, realtors, referral
well,
partners?
it's a great question to pose, Michael. I feel very strongly that 80% of everything that we do professionally, whether we're mortgage bankers or physicians, accountants, so much of what you do is how you present yourself and you sell what you're trying to purvey to someone. Whether it's a mortgage, whether it's a healthcare plan, whether it's an automobile, you really have to have good skills to do any job. And if you have good sales skills, good communication skills, whether you're in a tasting room or you're selling mortgage, those are important skills to have in order to be successful. My kids, I often tell them, the world is full of genius derelicts. And what I mean is, somebody that is just brilliant, PhD from Harvard, but they can't communicate. They don't know how to communicate. They're in a back room, locked up, staring into a petri dish. Those people can't do a lot of jobs. And good for them for doing the jobs that they could do. But if you have good sales skills and good relational skills, you listen well, those translate to a lot of success professionally, in my opinion.
Do you think that's a natural disposition for you?
Yes.
Were you taught that by maybe more your mom versus your dad, an uncle, or someone? Or is that just something you don't even work on, that disposition? It's just
I think
very
it's inherent to a large degree. I think you can always spend time developing those skills, but you have to have that at your core to begin with. Some people just aren't comfortable public speaking or engaging. My family laughs because if you drop me into a room filled with 100 people that I don't know, I'm totally comfortable. And a lot of people are not comfortable in those situations. It's just never bothered me.
Yeah, there's an inborn, inherent confidence that comes from some part of your childhood. So let's shift over to mortgage. Yeah. So this is 2000 roughly, right? Without dating ourselves, although I could date myself. I got in 99. So I think we both got in roughly the
Similar
same
year.
time.
Yeah.
Timing could not have been better. Then Alt-A products started to come out in 2001, 2002. Similar to you, I actually started but I started a mortgage company working in a closing department. So I learned the whole back end of the business before the front end of the business. I was supposed to go to law school. And as I left to go to law school, they said, hey, if you run into anyone that needs a mortgage, just, stay on with an email address and load it up, right? And one thing led to another. Because of that timing of the early 2000s, which was coming right out of that tech boom bust, I should say, Post the boom, there was like this tech bust that I'm sure you were very familiar with where you were
Just
living,
right in the middle of it.
right in the middle of it. So you work for Bank of America. So as we always talk about, there's three major places, four technically, but three major places to work for. You have institutional banks like a Bank of America that you worked at. There's the independent mortgage bankers, and then the platform that we're on today is brokers. Some would argue that there's also a credit union, but we kind of lump that together with the big banks. Having said that, how long did you stay at Bank of America?
Well, I think those were all really important experiences. I had the gift of a friend of mine who at the time was a product specialist for home equity at Wells Fargo, and he really understood the mortgage industry. And he said, "Listen, this is how you develop your career." And it was serendipitous to some degree, but it was also planned. So I started off in a retail bank and cut my teeth. You're only selling one product suite, one lender's rules and underwrite. But I really understood fast. I used to sit in a branch, you get fed leads. That was a really good sort of learning time for me. I at the time didn't like how Wells Fargo seemed to be the most aggressive of the retail banks. And we had Countrywide back then too, right? And the Washington Mutuals. Those banks were doing some pretty aggressive things. But the friend that I mentioned that was sort of a mentor on how to direct my career, as I left Bank of America Retail, I went to work for Wells Fargo in their builder division. And that was a really good opportunity for me to continue to cut my teeth. They had good products. And I had access to a lot of high-rise new construction in San Francisco at the time. And so while those were very long escrow periods, those were sometimes 18 and 24-month escrows while they finished to build that new construction, all those high rises. We call it South of Market now in South San Francisco, but it's a huge development that proliferated 15 years ago. And I was a part of that. And I was put on all of the select projects, the Millennium and Rincon Hill and Montgomery, all these really cool buildings. And I had access to a lot of clients, and I was undeniable at the time because I was able to purvey a very long rate lock, and those products at the time gave you a free float down at the end of your escrow if the rates were better. It was a win-win for the client, but it kept them loyal to me at the time. So I built a large database of clients. They all closed, within 6 months of each other. That was step 2 of that transition of my career. Again, cutting my teeth, really understanding the business. From there, Wells Fargo had a platform, and you remember this, it was called PNB or private mortgage, where you have a lot more ownership of the files. They had a joint venture with a very big and popular local real estate company called Alon Pinnell, which is now part of Compass. But Alon Pinnell, gosh, there must have been 150 agents in that office. I had an office inside that building right next to them and continued to support realtors on the PNB platform of Wells Fargo. That went on for about 5 years. That was very robust. And then at the end of that window, it started, and you might recall this, Michael, there was a time when the regulatory agencies were not thrilled with joint ventures. They felt like there could be some steering.
Quid pro quo.
Yeah, really you were delivering a good service, in my opinion, but that for a little while was unfashionable. And so a big group of bankers and myself that had always been in these same banks and the builder divisions and at Alon Pinnell, most of us went to a small national bank, but you might recall Everbank.
Sure.
A bunch of us went there. I was there for a few years. And then in the wake of that experience, this is where you and I came together, I think, because I moved over to the correspondent channel away from a retail bank and spent 8, almost 9 years at Guaranteed Rate, which is now referred to as Rate.
So how was that transition for you? Because I remember when I transitioned, I had one extra stop than you did. I did correspondent IMB until 2008. And then from 2008 to 2018, I went to the big banks. And then in 18, like yourself, I left the big banks and went to Guaranteed Rate, which is where you and I eventually met. But for me, it was very challenging coming out of the big bank to an IMB, because although the big banks are these small little white boxes that just have one little matrix and one little set of guidelines, it was humbling for me to get into the IMB space and realize that I had so much more to learn, even though I was like one of the top originators doing hundreds of millions of dollars a year. At that point in my career, I had funded well north of 4 or 5 billion dollars of business, but I almost had to relearn the business in 2018. This is after I'm already in the business over 18 years. Did you have a similar experience leaving the big banks and going over to the IMBs?
I did. I mean, there's a learning curve, but I think where people fall down and don't recognize, you do suddenly have access to a whole suite of new toys, new products. You go from one guideline to 130, 150 different bank guidelines. I think where people, I think what's important when you make that transition is you take a step back and recognize that really most of the time you are pushing your loans to 6, 7, or 8 different institutions that do a really good job for 80 or 90% of your clients. And what's nice about this, that next step that you and I took, in my opinion, was that you had opportunities where you could, if somebody didn't fit, they were square and trying to, jam them into a round hole. You didn't need to do that anymore. You had opportunities for people to secure financing that, probably in a retail bank you couldn't often do because they were very limited in what they were willing to do with their guidelines, right? So I think it was intimidating at first. Gosh, how am I going to know all these banks? How am I going to know, all this guideline is too much, and your eyes roll back in your head. But really, you just need to focus on those banks that do a good job, that are, and I still do it even on our current platform. The banks that care about your escrow timeline, they are accessible. I think communication, like since day one of my career in any industry, the communication is important. And there's 6 or 8 or 10 different banks that are good communicators that you and I push our loans to, that price well, and they care about your escrow. And that's important.
Yeah, I remember clearly when I first got to the IMB model, and I was coming out of the big banks. And the year before, I had done over $300 million worth of production. So I had done a lot of loans. And I remember I had this deal and we were trying to put it through JP Morgan or Chase. I forget which one it was. And the underwriter comes back and says, yeah, we're not going to be able to do this. I was like, why? And they told me something about the way they were calculating the income. And I said, great, just go for an exception. Here are your 5 compensating factors. Call them for an exception. And the underwriter at the IMB said, there's no exceptions here. What do you do? It doesn't fit to the guidelines. Go back to the pricing engine and find someone who will do it with, these with your debt to income ratio, whatever it was. I remember going, wait, when I was at a big bank, I could get this done by exception. Now as an IMB, I can't. But then rolling over to the platform we're on now, like really opened my eyes to where all the gold really sits in the broker model. So what was that like for you? Because you and I spoke and it was a very big transition for you. So maybe you could share with other people that might be considering it.
I was very comfortable on the correspondent side with rate. There was a lot of things that were going well for me, but you almost had to drag me by the hair over to the broker side. It's been about a year, about 13 or 14 months. Maybe I wasn't ready previous to that time, but, I wish I had made the move sooner. I really, really like not having to ask for permission when I want to price aggressively. And I say this often, I almost never say no. I always have an opportunity to help just about anyone when I've never really had that strength, that superpower before. It's not as if, and I say this before when we had the crash in, what was it, '09 and 10, I used to say, if I put a mirror under your nose and it steamed up, I give you $1 million. Those days are gone, and it's a good thing. People really do need to qualify in some manner. There's none, 100% financing, stated income, 1% start rate, option arm. That stuff was shame on the industry and shame on the consumer for gobbling that stuff up. It was not a stable environment for lending. If somebody's self-employed and they write off a lot of their income like so many do, we have vehicles for them. If I can demonstrate that you've got this cash flow and you've got these assets that I can utilize, there's options for you and you're not a risk. You've got, a stable position to lend upon, and you get to buy a house or refinance your house or buy an investment property.
Very empowering for you to support people like that.
Yeah, it feels good. It feels good. That's what I love about this business.
Yeah, if I could take you back for a second though, because a lot of people that I talk to have that very deep fear like you did. And obviously, you're long past that fear factor, and now you're on the right side of it, and things all worked out, thank God. But if someone else was listening and was on the fence here about the fear of leaving the IMBs or the comfort of wherever they are, to the opportunities that are on the other side. Because almost to your example before, it's almost like a candy shop. And there's sometimes you have two different personalities. You have someone that walks into a candy shop and goes right for what they want. You have others that come in and are so overwhelmed and their ADD kicks in and they can't pick anything, right? And then there are those that need their parent, right? The kid that needs a parent to tell them which candy they are getting. So if you were talking to someone on the other side of the fear factor, as you may, now that you're on this side and love it and appreciate it, what advice would you give them?
Well, I can remind people, as I had to remind myself, look, if I didn't like this, my employer at Rate would take me back in a minute, still will, right? Retail banks would take you back in a minute. Everybody that does any measure of volume and competency in this industry can just about go anywhere they want and have a job, which is a blessing for us in this industry, right? I would say that where we are now, I still have a lot of the same institutions that I used to have at Rate. Some of the same account managers, they're still on my phone. I still get to call them. It's really not that different. It's just so much better from a control, pricing and control, and the breadth of offerings that we have are endless. It's really fun to know that I can step into a conference with a prospective buyer and know that depending on how they answer my questions, I know I'm going to have something for them. I don't have to tell them, look, call so-and-so over here or my friend over here at this retail bank or cronies at Rate. I do all of it. And I never had that confidence before. It's not that disparate. It's not that different from being at a correspondent. It's just not. You just have you get a lot more control, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I had someone this morning call me, and I'm sure you run into these situations, and I'm curious to know what, like, your funniest interaction that you've ever had in this business, and whether that's with a realtor or a client or someone like that. I had this morning someone call me to your last point, which is, they said, I just opened escrow, buying for $2 million, putting down 20%. My friend just bought a house. And he said that if you park $2 million at Wells Fargo, you can get a 5% interest rate. So I said to him, well, that's great. But let's talk about this for a second. There's two things you need to understand. Number one, are you comfortable tricking the bank? I just want you to understand, I'm not here. I'm not the ethics police or anything like that. But Wells Fargo takes you $2 million because they're hoping that they make money off of that and therefore use it as a dangling carrot and by giving you a lower interest rate on your mortgage. If you're going into this just to fool the bank, and by all means, if you don't feel any sort of responsibility, that's fine. And this client actually said, I don't really care. They have games that they play against us. These are the games we play against them. I said, okay, fair. Having said that, last time we spoke back in May, I looked at your 22 and 23 tax returns. Send me your 24 tax returns, and let me just look your 23s and 24s, because let me see if you're even going to qualify with those big banks. Forget the rate they can give you. And he sent me his tax returns, and guess what? He writes off over $70,000 of meals and entertainment. Now, you don't realize that
For him.
because when you take a K1, as anyone that knows underwriting, they'll just use the bottom of the K1. He's like, but my K1 shows 250. I was like, your K1 does show 250, but when they look at the actual S Corp, they're going to then also deduct your meals and entertainment and take you down to 160 or 170, whatever it is. He's like, they can't do that. I was like, no, that is how they do that. And there's nothing wrong. That's a conservative approach.
You can't have it both ways. You can't not claim the income and then use it.
Correct. So if you had similar stories like that, maybe you want to share with anyone listening, and or a funny story that you had an interaction over with that,
Well, I've had people to the finish line days before close of escrow, and they, somebody on my team calls me and says, hey, Chris, they just listed their house for sale. And I have the conversation with them, like an investment property, and I was using the rental income to qualify. And I'm like, yeah, so if you do that, then I can't use the rental income to help you qualify. And guess what? We're going to have to tap the brakes on this until you sell or until you gainfully re-rent that property. I think there's a lot of consumers out there It still might have a hangover from the days when our industry wasn't as scrutinizing as it should have been. And it certainly is now. And I joke with people, listen, if my team, if we are asking you to source the change in your ashtray of your car, please do it, because we're just the messengers and people forget that. Do what we ask of you. It feels like you're, doing your taxes every day for a couple of weeks, but guess what? At the end of this process, all of that washes away and you've got keys to a multi-million-dollar home, and I'm on your Christmas card list. Let's go. Let's do this. I think the short answer is a lot of folks just don't realize that this is a very black and white. I make the reference a lot. Imagine my average loan size is about $1 million because that's the nature of where I live. And people think that it's like, well, what do you need that for? You've heard that response before when we've asked for a piece of paper or something of that nature. And, I say, well, listen, this industry, we don't do this on cocktail napkins. It's not a handshake industry. And imagine what $1 million or $2 million looks like in a gym bag. Imagine all those $100 bills stacked together, like you've walked around in Las Vegas and seen those big Vegas, those card tournaments, and there's like millions of dollars sitting on a table. It doesn't even look real. And I remind people, listen, that we're going to ask you very detailed questions, and you just need to respond, lay down and do the work with us so that I can give you those gym bags of $100 bills. That's all you have to do, right? And sometimes I think that perspective helps people understand that, when you're borrowing a lot of money, and, in our markets in California, we don't do a lot of, $200,000 purchase price, it's still very significant for that market. But, we're talking about millions of dollars generally on those coastal areas and where I live and where you live. And yeah, I don't blame those banks for being scrutinizing. They should make sure that these loans are very secure.
So people that are getting to know you, right, as
Mhm.
Chris, and I can take tremendous pride and pleasure in getting to see how much you've evolved over the last year and change that we've gotten to know each other, right? You had come to me a little while ago and you were having a rough day or a rough week, whatever it was. And you were like, Michael, I don't want more of these phone calls when my borrowers are screaming at me, screaming at my borrowers. My realtors, my referral partners are screaming at me. I'm screaming at them. I don't want that life anymore. And for those of us that have been doing this as long as you and I have, there comes this moment of aha moment. And I think it might have even correlated with you getting back from a trip. You spent some real quality time with your family and got to see the real important things of life. And you get to this place in life where you want to reach this maturity of like, why can I enjoy this? And ever since then, I've watched you evolve and mature at such a high level. And we joke, but I always nickname you Calm Chris. And anyone that's watching this podcast can even see just how calm your demeanor is. What do you do to work on that? Some of it's inherent, like you said before, but where do you go to mentally? And what advice can you give to someone else that's, in our business, it's a lot of hair on fire, a lot of bull in a china shop. How do you find that calm place, and how do you know where and when to plug that in?
Well, I think you have to work on it always. I think you always have to ask yourself every day with a gratitude, self-reflection, and remind yourself what's important: your family, your spouse, your dogs, if that's your thing, but whatever it is. And I hate saying this, it's very cliche. You've heard it before, but our industry really, nobody's dying on the operating table. Right. But you do have to take into consideration that when millions of dollars often are on the line, I have found that, we are socially conditioned to present ourselves in a certain way that's honorable and respectable as human beings. But when there's a lot of stress and a lot at stake, I think the true person manifests and they come to the surface, and you see who they are for real. And managing people that really mask the way that they deal with stress most of the time, and they come to the surface, really not managing it as a result of a very high stakes real estate transaction. I think people like you and me who've seen it all, staying calm isn't just good for us, but it's a lot better for them too, to understand that we're not panicking because we understand that this is going to work out. This is not, every deal's different. Every deal is a puzzle, and, being calm isn't just good for me. The way that I manage it, I mountain bike a lot. You know that I live in the birthplace of mountain biking, and that's not just good for me physically, but it's also good for me mentally. Just gets all of that minutia and that stress out of my head, and a good night's sleep. And I feel really good the next day. And I feel like I can fight a whole day and the next day and the next day after that. And then, on Friday, end of day, I'll field calls and look at texts all weekend, but I'm right back into the family mode. Early in my career, I used to get really bothered with Sunday night phone calls at 9 o'clock. It's like, really, you couldn't wait until tomorrow morning? It used to really bother me. But I've learned over the years, listen, this is very important to this person. And a few minutes doesn't mean that it ruined my time and my day. If I give somebody a few minutes of my time, it's not an encroachment of my quality of life. It's no big deal. I never step out into the door jam of a restaurant when I'm having dinner with my family or friends. They can wait 30 minutes. But those little touches of service, even if it's 30 minutes later, that helps keep them calm and reminds them that, you've got it under control. You've even taught me a little bit, the communication piece. Sometimes people just need to know that you don't know right now, but certainly you're going to alert them when you get that answer, when that piece of paper is rubber stamped and we can move on to the next step towards closing. And those are just learned things. Some of that's inherent, but I think a lot of people that have a lot of success in our industry, they better start from a place of having those skill sets sort of embedded in them, being calm. The real estate offices that I support, I don't know it. I don't see it in myself as much as I'm being told sometimes, Chris, we love you around here because you always are so calm. Sometimes I don't feel that way, but I must project that, and there must be
You're
some truth to
masking
it. Yeah.
You're masking it really, really well. It's
Yeah.
funny. You remind me of a funny story. So back at a company that I think we both worked at, we were once on this president's trip, chairman trip, whatever it is, where they take you away. And I remember they had this like breakout session. In the breakout session, there was a woman who's one of the top originators in the country, and they asked her to speak. And she got up, and this is a pretty coveted position. And I've done it back when I was at some of these big banks, when I was like the number one producer. They always like the top people to speak, which is always a find funny versus the rising stars. But they love, promote the people at the top. So she's talking, and people ask her, how does she do so much business and whatever? And she says, look, we don't have the best rates here. We don't have the best products here, but I will kill for my clients. And because of that, I find ways to make it work or whatever. Now, as the owner of the company, he did not react very well to this because he doesn't want you getting up in front of 500 or 1,000 of his loan officers saying we don't have, even though we get the point she was trying to make. So she was put in the doghouse. Now there's an award show like a night or two later, and she gets up at the award show and she grabs another mic. Now at this point, everyone on the trip knows that there's like a little beef going on here. She gets and she doubles down on this. She goes and she said what you said before. She says, I am here. I'm very grateful that my husband made the time to come with me on this trip. My husband is a brain surgeon. When my husband goes to work every day, people can live or die. What we do, not nearly as important. That was like her mic drop. I don't think they ever
I was
asked her to
there and I
speak
remember
again.
that moment. Yeah. I was at that trip.
She had doubled down from bad to worse with upper management. So that was like, but it's funny, but I agree with what she's saying, what you had said before, which really, really resonates. So like, yes, we're not doing brain surgery, but at the same time, you are in your world of what you're doing. You have to be very conscious that this is the largest financial decision most people are going to ever make. And
100%.
know when they come into this, we need to give them that little bit of TLC. As we round this out, I'd love to ask you, favorite book? I've been doing this a lot on this Most Mindset podcast that I do, and I talk to people in terms of like, what book do you feel earlier in your childhood, earlier in your career, or even later in your career had a huge impact on you, and why?
Let's see. So I tend to gravitate to nonfiction. I like history. A book that resonated with me when I was young, I remember reading Siddhartha, which is an interesting book. But I would say favorite book these days, probably Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. That was, sometimes you read a book and it makes the hair on your forearm stand up. And that was one of those moments for me. I struggle sometimes looking through and reading and digesting some of those self-help and the coaching stuff that we're always supposed to be reading up on. I can't really get into those. Anything historically relevant, I love that stuff because it's real. It's what shapes all of the fiction out there is the truth, the nonfiction. So Into
Yeah,
Thin Air
those
is probably
self-help books are tough. The self-help books talk a lot in theory and almost in a genius way promote you to keep reading chapter after chapter after chapter, and then there's nothing applicable.
I think you can find, if you listen to books like that, it's a little better than reading them.
True. I just find that people like us in our generation are a lot more visual, and it's very difficult to visualize what they're trying to say conceptually into visualizing it into actually tasking it. So it gets a little more complex like that. But I want to thank you, Chris. This was amazing. We have built this most mindset to help people that feel where they're at, undervalued, underpaid, right? Underrecognized. And we try to make it a very different concept here, working on the team and just working together with people and make you feel like the best version of yourself. And I could say, getting to know you over the last year, I've seen tremendous strides in that. And, peeling away those layers and getting to see the real you is just so enjoyable, and appreciate that you made the time to come today.
Dude, it's been a pleasure, man. I always enjoy chatting with you. Appreciate all that you do for us, and it's been fun. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks.
See you,
Chris.
man. See you, buddy.